Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Ed Smith and I'm the director of the T2D network at the Institute for Health System Transformation and Sustainability, or IHSTS for short. IHSTS is a small BC-based NGO, and for the past several years we've been focused on developing a provincial type 2 diabetes strategy, part of which has been the creation of the T2D network. The network's focused on the prevention, the management and remission from type 2 diabetes, and we're fortunate to have a great bunch of partners nationally that we work with. A core component of the network is education, which is why we're here today. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce Krista Lamb, who's going to be moderating our session today. Krista Lamb is a science communicator who specializes in translating complex topics into interesting and understandable stories for diverse audiences. Her first book, Beyond Banting, was released in 2021 and went on to win the Science Writers and Communicators of Canada Book Award. In addition, Krista has been the producer and host of multiple podcasts, including the award-winning Diabetes Canada podcast and How to Talk About Health. In 2025, she received a King Charles III Coronation Medal from the Royal Canadian Institute for Science in recognition of her commitment to fostering science culture in Canada. So with that, I'll hand this back over to Krista, who will introduce our guest for today. Thanks so much.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Krista Lamb, and I am your host today for the Type 2 Diabetes Network. I'm looking so forward to this conversation with Dr. Charles Helm. And first and foremost, Dr. Helm, I'll get you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you, Krista. It's wonderful to be with you today. So I am Dr. Charles Helm. I practice in Tumbler Ridge in northeastern British Columbia, which is a remote community of, let's say, 2,500 people. I've been working in Tumbler Ridge since 1992, and I'm also a paleontologist because a few years ago I decided to semi-retire and pursue a PhD in paleontology at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. So I've got a combined perspective from the two careers.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. And I'm really excited today to talk to you about rural health, which is something that I haven't had an opportunity to speak to someone, to interview someone about before. So I'm exceptionally interested in this particular topic. And so why is it so important that we invest in rural health? And I guess first and foremost, if you could explain what it is to people who might not be familiar.
Right. So for me, rural needs to lead the way. I'm very proudly rural. I mean, I don't understand why we don't have a long lineup of physicians queuing up to work in Tumbler Ridge like my community. Instead, we've got a physician shortage here. I just don't understand it because I come from a different mindset, I guess, where being rural is just wonderful and enjoyable. And from my perspective, I live in the best place I possibly can in the world. And other people might have the same perspective for wherever they might be, and that's wonderful. But the point is just that if one believes that, one is inherently kind of a feel-good inside, happy person. So that's really important. But I honestly think that rural can lead the way, and especially in things like type 2 diabetes. Because in my community, for example, we have one high school, one elementary school, one health center, one clinic, one pharmacist, one garage. It goes on and on, one of everything, one major employer. And that enables us to do things that would be orders of magnitude more complex in a city or in any bigger place. And so I don't think of rural as a sort of poor country cousin. I think of rural as leading the way. And for some reason, ever since I was at high school, actually, I dreamt not of just becoming a doctor, but of becoming a rural doctor. So for me, to have had this career in rural medicine has just been a real blessing and a dream come true.
Amazing. And what are some of the misconceptions that people have about doing healthcare in rural settings?
Well, it's actually a lot easier now than it was even 30 years ago when I started off, because then sometimes one was really lonely. If you had an X-ray of a neck injury, say in the middle of the night, and you would have to talk to a radiologist and try and explain what you were seeing and ask them for an opinion. Now you just push it to the grid, and in real time, you're looking at the same thing the radiologist is looking at, and it's so easy. So it's become a lot less lonely. So I think the one thing that new grads fear is loneliness. But in British Columbia, we have this wonderful thing called RTVS, real-time virtual support, where you've got basically friends who are there to help guide you through any emergency situation that you can possibly imagine. And that also is tremendously consoling. I did without that for most of my career. But wow, what an opportunity to have people like that around these days. So things have come a long way.
Excellent. And some of the things that you have said before, you said that rural communities can outperform urban communities sometimes. And what did you mean when you said that?
Well, just that we can lead the way. Because if we think, for example, of type 2 diabetes, and I mean, I'm personally very interested in type 2 diabetes remission. But so here we can have a community-driven initiative, which would be very hard to replicate in a bigger place. So, for example, we have our mayor and council fully on board with the concept of a food-first, community-driven type 2 diabetes remission project, supporting us with giving in-kind donations such as a space for our health navigator coach to work, writing letters of support for other funding applications, even considering in the longer term being willing to fund such a position. And this is the sort of thing that you would struggle to achieve or even to put into practice in a larger place. So I'm just really excited because, look, I semi-retired from my medical career. And then I realized, look, I've got unfinished business. I believed what I was taught, and there's just no critique of my teachers. They all had nothing but the best of intentions, but just maybe sometimes I wasn't always taught what in retrospect was the right thing. And so you finish your career and you think, oh my goodness, I maybe followed those guidelines too rigidly, or I didn't think enough for myself in this regard, in particular with regard to type 2 diabetes. And it's almost like then one has this feeling of obligation to, no, I've got to do something to try and correct that wrong, that deficiency. And I suppose that's really what we're up to these days in Tumbler Ridge.
Yes, and you mentioned type 2 diabetes remission. I think that for a lot of people, they're not aware that there is a lot of different research happening with type 2 diabetes remission in various different forms. Some of it is medication remission, some of it is lifestyle-based remission, and there are all sorts of different elements that are potentially going into it. So I'll let you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing there.
Right. Well, I think one of the main things is that every newly diagnosed patient with type 2 diabetes or with pre-diabetes or even with insulin resistance, if you can catch them, because you're going to have a certain cohort with type 2 diabetes and then probably a bigger cohort with pre-diabetes and an even bigger cohort. Just about everybody in North America seems to have some degree of insulin resistance. So if you catch these people in time, anything is possible. And to me, this is, when I put on my paleontological lens, our distant ancestors, and by the way, I've just been part of a paper indicating that everybody started off in South Africa. We all began there. The human diaspora began where I grew up in the Cape South coast of South Africa. So I must congratulate you as well, Krista, on being South African. But if we look back then, people had such a good balanced diet. And that's one of the features that I've seen, including using seafood for the first time on a conscious basis. And the even theories, hypotheses that all the omega-3 fatty acids improved our brain health. And that's what enabled us to have the gumption to migrate and leave Africa. Can't prove that, but I mean, it's certainly an interesting concept. So I also know that those ancestors of ours were often in ketosis. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. And so I think, we programmed, we're adapted to handle that sort of thing. And therefore, if we can be metabolically flexible today, in other words, sometimes we're depending on glucose, other times we're depending on ketones, and we can switch from the one to the other as the need arises. I think that's really healthy because that's what we're adapted to do. Whereas for most people in today's society, we're just surviving on glucose all the time and never being flexible in that regard. So those are some of my paleontologically inspired thoughts.
Excellent. And so I wanted to circle back a little bit back to the rural health because we've talked a little bit about the amazing reasons to be part of those communities and to work in those communities. But what are some of the gaps that people are facing that you have some ideas about how we could potentially fill?
Yeah. So, I mean, type 2 diabetes in my community, it's a big problem, but it's an even bigger problem in our neighboring First Nations. And we really cannot talk about rural health without talking about Indigenous health. And for people in those communities, it's not maybe will I develop type 2 diabetes one day? It's when am I going to develop my type 2 diabetes? Because in some of the First Nations, 70% of adults have type 2 diabetes, not pre-diabetes, established type 2 diabetes. And that's such a horrendous statistic, but so First Nations bear the brunt of type 2 diabetes in Canada. But I also see within Indigenous wisdom our salvation, because type 2 diabetes is such a disease of society and societal pressure, and how we almost are programmed these days to eat badly and to eat all the wrong things. And when I hear my Indigenous counterparts speak eloquently of type 2 diabetes being a colonial disease, and the pushback has to start at a very basic level, and where you realize that, you accept that, and then you realize that every person has a right to know that type 2 diabetes, can be put into remission. And that is so counter to what I was taught and what I believed for such a long time. I honestly, okay, you've got type 2 diabetes. Yeah, we can send you to the dietitian and we can recommend a bit of exercise, but almost you're checking those boxes. And now we're going to start metformin, and now we're going to start this and this, and now you're on this road. And we're going to do our best to keep your A1C down, but before you know it, you're going to be on 5 or 6 medications, and they might interact with each other or cause you side effects, but we can manage those. That's called the drug cascade. And it is so disempowering to people to be on that road and to know that really there's no escape. There's nowhere for them to go, but luckily, if they're lucky, they will die from something else before they get blindness or amputations or kidney disease or heart disease or strokes, any of those things. And now this message that for those who choose, because you have to work hard at the pushback. It's not just let's do it and it's easy. But for those who choose to do this, as 50%, 75%, depending on whom you listen to, can achieve remission. And that is so empowering. It's just so different. It gives people hope in the face of this dreadful disease, which is increasing exponentially and threatening to destroy our economy and keep us on this runaway train that we seem to be on, with no one knowing where the brake is. All these things. And now we can actually empower people and say, no, yes, you've got insulin resistance, or you've got pre-diabetes, or maybe even you've got type 2 diabetes, or maybe even you've been on medications for a couple of years, but maybe there's something we can do to give you hope and to put you on a different path. And let's talk about remission. And you have a right to know that remission is possible. And not everybody is going to want it. Some people are going to say, Doc, just give me my prescriptions. I'll go that way. I'm happy with that. But I think many people are going to say, yes, please, at least let's give this a try. And, remission is obviously a very worthy goal in itself. But even if a patient does not go into remission, but if they, for example, come down from being on 6 medications to 2, or they get the insulin dose, daily dose, down from 100 to 20, let's just say I mean, that's victory. It's not true remission because you're still on a few meds, but it's a victory compared to where you could have been. And the moment we get people off meds, that polypharmacy reduction, which I'm also passionate about, and we get people down, insulin dose down, then they're going to find the weight will come off more easily and the side effects from the medications will be less. So you turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. And to come back full circle, I think that's easier in rural communities than in urban.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely such an interesting time for this research. And I mean, I do always want to caution that not everybody is going to go into remission if they do this, but it is always good to make healthier choices, and eating well and exercising more, and all of those things are wonderful if you can achieve them. And also, we are very lucky. We're in a very lucky time now where if you don't end up going into remission, if for many reasons you're not able to do this, then we have so many other options. Whereas before we had very few options, so lots of different choices, which I think is a wonderful reason for optimism these days. So lovely to be able to say that. And so I mean, I know that to talk about the rural health issue is to talk often about how we inspire investment. So how do we inspire governments to invest in rural health?
That is a great question, and that is a challenge. So in British Columbia, within the last year, we had a rural health strategy commissioned by, this is an acronym, but RCCBC is the Rural Coordination Centre of BC and the government in combination. And a very gifted individual devised this rural health strategy. It was a long thing, but it deals with all these mental models of rural healthcare and why urban folks and governments sometimes have biases against rural. And this fantastic rural health strategy was submitted to the government, and now we've had a change at the top, and we've got a new Minister of Health, and so there've been a few changes. So it's taken longer than we hoped for it to be reviewed and accepted. But this is the kind of thing that we need, because we need to change people's mindsets about what rural is and what rural can be. Make no mistake, there are lots and lots of challenges, and the predominant of which is manpower. So if you are so short of qualified physicians and nurse practitioners and nurses, it gets very difficult to practice the kind of way you want to. And without people, it's very difficult to practice good medicine. And that's our challenge. And we can, that in itself could occupy a couple of hours of discussion. But we just have to, in the short term, we have to try and get around those challenges, but they are very real. So I see all the virtues of rural healthcare, but I also see the challenges.
Yeah, I know that for many people across Canada, the issue of access is such a challenge in and of itself. Even having a family doctor, having someone to, an endocrinologist might be completely out of your scope if you're not able to travel. So I think those are very important things. And to wrap up our conversation, I wanted to ask the last question I ask everyone, which is there anything that I've missed that you would like people to know about this topic that you'd like to add?
Well, I can maybe just say that when I semi-retired here, they asked me to give a little speech, and I said, one of the things that I'm the most proud of in my tenure here, firstly, we kept wait lists down to a few days. If there was a wait list of a week, we were worried, what are we doing wrong? But probably the main thing is that our remote community, which we're 120 kilometers away from the next nearest, from our referral center. And in those 28, 30 years, there were only a couple of hours when we didn't have a physician available in the community to answer emergencies. And those few hours when we'd say had a major trauma that was so severe that both doctors had to go in the ambulance. And so we made a calculated decision to leave our community for a few hours because we had such a major trauma case. And those were otherwise we had 100%. That was about 5 years ago. And since then, there's been this horrible word called diversion, which I had never heard of before. Never heard of the word diversion, didn't exist. And Now it is commonplace. Oh, we're on diversion, either for a lack of nurses or a lack of doctors. And it's just terrible. And it's become the new norm. So people are just used to it. And this is the way life is. Well, it's not the way life should be in a first world country like Canada. These things just shouldn't be happening. And I do not want to be in the shoes of the health authority, because they've got a very, very difficult job. But it really is a societal thing, just like type 2 diabetes is now a societal disease. It never used to be. And when I was a medical student, type 1 diabetes we were taught a lot about, and sort of incidentally we were taught about type 2. It's rare, you might see it every now and then. Now it's an epidemic. It's everywhere. And we got to say, in those 40, 50 years, what has happened? Well, I know what's happened. And I think it's just time for us to start pushing back if we possibly can, in every single way we can.
Excellent. I think those are very wise words. And I'm so glad that we had the chance to have this conversation.
Great pleasure for me, Krista. Thank you for having me on your show.
Wonderful. And thank you to everybody for watching or listening today. If you'd like more information on the Type 2 Diabetes Network, we'll have that information in the show notes for you. And you can find out everything at t2dnetwork.ca. Thanks again.